Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. In this one, I'm going to be taking a look at Juggernaut. He's been largely useless in the game since he came out, specifically because he didn't have a uniform or any kind of upgrade to be usable in higher level content. However, now he does have both of those things, and I have to say that he is pretty solid in PvE and quite good in PvP. You're likely not going to use the character for things like timeline because there are so many top tier options there, but he is quite good in Alliance Conquest. However, if you don't play that, you can definitely use him in things like World Boss Legend and even ABX to an extent. Because I previously covered Juggernaut's performance improvement from T2 to Awakening, which you can see in the overview video that I made previously, I ended up just going straight into Knull Stage 9 to show you what he can do in World Boss Legend. The current build that I'm using for testing is just the CTP of Regen, though if you do want to build the character specifically for PvE, then a CTP of Energy could definitely work, and you can also use a CTP of Rage if you want to try to get the most out of the damage accumulation from the third skill. The reason I mention this is because the fourth and fifth skill are iframes, so you won't really be able to take damage and accumulate that buff higher up, so a CTP of Rage might be a little bit easier to play in that case. But if you do want to risk just cancelling the third skill right away, you can use something like a CTP of Energy since his skills are kind of proc friendly. Alternatively, you can also use a CTP of Destruction to try to get a little bit of a hybrid build going and get some more use out of him in PvP. So basically, even though he doesn't have any guaranteed crit rate, the Rage will make it a little bit easier to accumulate and go through your skills and make the character more viable for things like Giant Boss Raid and ABX. However, for pushing to higher stages of World Boss Legend, then you're probably going to want something like a Reforged Energy or a Destruction if you want him, again, a little bit more of a hybrid character. You can see that with no leadership, support, or even a proc, I'm still able to complete a stage 9 with over 2 minutes and 20 seconds remaining. Unfortunately, I couldn't clear the next highest stage of Knull available to Juggernaut as a villain type, which was 35, but I did get pretty close to that 3 minutes remaining mark, which is usually what indicates that the character has enough time to complete the rest of the stage. I was about 24 seconds late in clearing the first phase on time, but with a single skill damage proc, again either an energy or a destruction, you should be able to easily clear the first phase in time, since from my experience, a destruction or energy will improve your clear time by anywhere from a minute and 20 or a minute 30 seconds to all the way up to 2 minutes, depending on the character's kit. Juggernaut's skill rotation is actually pretty simple and is very similar to Hulk's. You do 3, cancel 4, and then delay cancel after he hits the hammer on the ground, and then go into the 5th skill. With the Awakening skill unlocked, you basically use the 6th skill right after you use the 3rd skill, and then go into your regular rotation. So that would be 3, cancel 6, cancel 4, delay cancel 5. If you're using a CTP of Rage, you can stay in the 3rd skill until the damage proc activates or the skill ends, and then go into that rotation. Even though I was still using a regen, I did take him into a Giant Boss Raid Dormammu on the combat type advantage day, and I was able to clear the first phase with over 8 minutes remaining, which is a good sign because usually if the character can complete the first phase with about 8 minutes to 8.5 minutes remaining, then they can complete the entire fight. Keep in mind that although I did mention the rotation is pretty straightforward, actually playing the character might be a little bit trickier since you do have to really focus on taking damage when that 3rd skill is active. Fortunately, you can move around with the 3rd skill, so you can dip into the AoE or damage effects on the arena to fill that meter up or the buff up so that all your other skills do more damage. I also did take him into ABX just to see how he would do, and I was a little bit short of that 8 million mark, which is usually what you want to see if you don't have a damage proc, meaning that he's probably not one of the best options for the combat villain day. However, if you don't have characters like Titania or Doc Ock, or even Hulk past level 70, then he isn't too bad of an option. Also keep in mind that he doesn't have burn in his kit, so if you are going to use him in ABX, he's mostly going to be useful in the seasons where you have to use paralysis or silence. He has paralysis on his 2nd and 5th skill and silence on his 4th skill. You might not be too interested in seeing his performance in PvE without a damage proc like I showed, but the build that I'm using is specifically to test him in PvP, which I will show right after the stat bump that I'm showing now. I'm showing the stat bump increase because I want you to focus on the HP increase, which is pretty substantial with the new uniform, considering that he gets 30% additional health with the uniform passive and a pretty massive stat bump to health with the awakening upgrade, or transcendence rather. His HP for me goes up by 31,000, which if you also have the artifact increases by even more, since he did get that Gilgamesh artifact that can improve his health by around, I believe, 80% or 75% or something like that, as well as heal for a similar amount when he gets to low health. The new uniform adds a ton of effects for Juggernaut survival in PvP. He not only gets that increased health on his uniform passive like I mentioned, but he also gets increased defenses from his tier 1 passive, as well as the damage mitigation increasing by about 15% there as well. On top of that, he also gets increased healing per second from his tier 2 passive, going up by 1.5%, and his second and fifth skill now both give him invincible, and to add to that, the fourth skill also gives him 30% healing every time he uses it, which is very often because they gave that skill an iframe ignore and a short cooldown. So in many ways it acts very similar to Spider-Man's fourth skill. He frequently goes into iframe ignore when the opponent iframes, and he heals up all the time. I almost forgot to mention that the fourth skill also provides an attack and defense buff to him, and when he does get to low health, that tier 2 passive also provides a ridiculous 60% increase to attack and defenses as well. Offensively, he gets that increased skill damage and bonus damage on his uniform passive, as well as the damage buff that I mentioned on the fourth skill and the tier 2 passive, but on top of that, he also gets that massive damage accumulation buff on his third skill, as well as a damage proc on his fifth skill. I'd say that the AI's rotation is pretty good with Juggernaut. He usually opens up with the fourth skill, mostly because the opponent tends to iframe at the start, but that's good for Juggernaut because it gives him the damage proc right away. It then follows up with the fifth skill most often, which is also good because it has a damage proc that goes across 2 skills, and the fifth skill does a lot of damage. By the time that the fifth skill animation ends, the fourth skill is usually off cooldown, which is really good because it transfers to the next highest damage skill. From there, if both the fifth and fourth skill are down, Juggernaut usually goes into the third skill, which adds even more damage, and if all of those skills are down, he usually goes into his second skill, which gives you that invincible. You can see that with the current kit and AI rotation, Juggernaut is doing fairly well since I was able to get to the last character, considering that both Warlock and Emma directly counter Juggernaut because he is a combat type. The one main negative of Juggernaut's kit is that he doesn't have any penetration on his skills 1 through 5, and it's mostly restricted to his awakening skill. To account for that, you can try to run a CTP of destruction on him, like I mentioned earlier with the hybrid build. However, I did have a couple of players try this out for me. I didn't try it out myself, and they noticed that it didn't work out as well as they had expected. The issue with this is that it really hurts his survivability, even though his base survivability is good if you don't consider any CTPs or custom gears as is. However, by running something like a CTP of regen, which I would highly recommend and is what I'm using, his survivability increases very drastically because he's constantly activating his fourth skill to heal, which the recovery from the regen will increase even more, as well as the fact that he's constantly healing from his passive skill. To add to that, the regen also synergizes very well with his artifact, which increases his base HP by a drastic amount, as well as giving him a massive one-time heal. The massive HP increase coupled with the recovery rate from the CTP will make healing per second and that constant fourth skill activation even better, not to mention that the fact that the HP shield will be even bigger because of the higher health. I found that this build worked out the best, especially if you can get a mighty CTP of regen that has that penetration option to interrupt the opponent, since it gives you the best chance of getting the penetration from your awakening skill to activate after that 30-second duration is up, which I found a lot of times he'll survive up to because his survival becomes so much better with the regen. Because he has super armor, you can alternatively even use something like a Transcendence if you wanted to, or even a CTP of Authority because his mitigation is so good from his passive, so you can couple the steal effect with his own mitigation. But for the reasons that I just described, I found that a regen is the most ideal option for him for PvP. You can actually notice from these clips all the different times where the penetration effect activates to stop all the damage coming in either from the AoE or active skills from the opponent, as well as the kind of orange icon appearing in the top right of the left hand side, which is his artifact activating to basically give him that massive heal as well as the increased overall health. But basically using this strategy of survival until you get awakening skills not only gave me the penetration, but allowed me to nuke very strong characters that I otherwise wouldn't be able to beat, like Emma or T4 Hulk. This strategy should also work in Alliance Conquest, where his health increases even more from the HP modifier, as well as the overall healing as a result of that. And you can see that because I'm using only solo Juggernaut and was able to survive the reflect and damage coming in from Silver Surfer, as well as the boosted villain damage bonus that Spider-Man is doing. So here's another test I did to see if Juggernaut could survive to get that penetration from the awakening skill. I'm facing him versus Knull, who has that immortality effect when he gets down to 1 health. He can survive for an additional 5 or 6 seconds, as well as versus Heimdall, who has that immunity bubble constantly up and protecting himself, as well as his teammates. I was actually fortunate enough to burst down these opponents in between their immunity or invincible effects, so I didn't even have to get the awakening skill to take them out. But despite that, you can see that the character can survive by himself for a long amount of time, so if you do pair him up with a character that has penetration, it should work out even better. He will kind of struggle versus characters that are meta and have invincible builds, but if they don't, you can see here that I was able to go one-on-one versus Thanos, and I'm pretty sure I was able to survive to that 15-second mark for the awakening to activate, but I was able to defeat him before even having to go into that. Keep in mind that the team I'm using is not optimal by any means. I'm simply using a basic debuff and health support, whereas the opponent had Colossus for that huge mitigation passive. As you can see, Juggernaut is a solid addition to your roster, specifically if you play Alliance Conquest. However, if you don't, you can still have a lot of fun with him in things like Alliance Battle Extreme and World Boss, Legend, or lower. The character isn't really meta shifting in any way, so you can definitely pass on him if you want, but if you do like the character, then it is a solid pickup. Just keep in mind that if you are planning on using the character for PvP, it does make a really significant difference when you do have his artifact. It can save him from dying and give you more of an opportunity to go into that awakening skill and nuke the opponent, as well as get penetration to take out any opponents following the awakening skill if they survive or revive. I'm likely going to be reviewing Titania and Absorbing Man next, likely in the same video, to kind of give you a comparison between the two characters since they are kind of similar to one another. And then following that, I'll try to give you a breakdown or guide on World Boss Legend Gore. That does round out this video though, so if you did enjoy it, please consider liking and subscribing and sharing the video with other people since it might help them out as well. Anyways, I appreciate you taking the time to watch this, but the video is now over.